Hello everyone to AP Government Politics Tips and Tricks, and today we're diving into the comprehensive history of the filibuster in the United States Senate. First, we need to define what the filibuster is. A filibuster is a procedural tactic in the United States Senate where one or more senators deliberately extend debate on a piece of legislation, effectively delaying or preventing a vote on the bill. The purpose of the filibuster is often to block or delay legislation by speaking for an extended period of time or using other procedural maneuvers. The tactic takes advantage of the Senate's rule of unlimited debate, which allows senators to speak on the floor without time limits. While the House of Representatives has strict time limits for debate, the Senate has historically allowed extended debate to encourage a thorough discussion. The filibuster has been used both as a tool to protect minority rights by ensuring debate and as a way to obstruct the legislative process. It's now time to dive into the origins and evolutions of the filibuster. In the early days of the Senate, the filibuster was not part of the original design of the Senate. The concept evolved from the Senate's emphasis on open and extended debate. In 1806, for example, Vice President Aaron Burr suggested removing the Senate's previous rule that allowed for a previous question or motion which could end debate by a majority vote. This led to the creation of a situation where there was no formal method to end debate, thus enabling the possibility and the creation of the filibuster in the United States Senate. As we transfer into the 19th century, the filibuster was rarely used. It was seen primarily as a way to protect the rights of the minority party and to foster compromise. It was more of a scare tactic. It was more of a weapon to use as a defense versus an offensive tool. But as we expand into the 20th century, we see an expansion in the use of the filibuster, which increased significantly in the 20th century as senators realized its potential to obstruct legislation. It was famously used to block civil rights legislation, among other measures. Let's now take a moment to dive into some of the most famous filibusters that have taken place during the U.S. Senate's history. The most famous being that of Strom-Thurmond's 1957 filibuster. Strom-Thurmond of South Carolina holds the record for having the longest individual filibuster in United States history. He spoke for 24 hours and 18 minutes against the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Despite his efforts, the bill passed ultimately. In the 1930s, we also had a filibuster done by Senator Huey Long. Senator Huey Long from Louisiana was known for his colorful and lengthy filibusters, often using his time on the floor to read from Shakespeare or recipes. He often used a filibuster to delay legislation he believed would benefit the wealthy at the expense of the poor. Let's now make a segue into the 21st century, where we have the 2013 Rand Paul's filibuster. Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky conducted a nearly 13-hour filibuster in protest of the United States government's drone policy. He used the tactic to draw attention to the lack of transparency and targeted drone killings of U.S. citizens. Another famous filibuster is that of Senator Ted Cruz from Texas. His 2013 filibuster lasted 21 hours, and his filibuster was against the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, which is technically not a filibuster because it did not delay a vote. His marathon speech was seen as a symbolic gesture against the law. Now let's talk about how do we potentially end the filibuster. After over 100 years of legislation, they realized very quickly that something needed to be done to try to end the filibuster, which was the creation of Rule 22, or the Cloture Rule. The Cloture Rule was introduced in 1917 after a group of senators used the filibuster to block a bill that would have armed U.S. merchant ships in the First World War. President Woodrow Wilson urged the Senate to change its rules to allow for the ending of debate. In response, the Senate adopted Rule 22, also known as the Cloture Rule. Also, there's a couple other evolutions and changes that have taken place. So we have this concept of original rule, which initially Cloture Rule required 2/3 majority of senators present and voting to end debate on a bill. This high threshold made it difficult to invoke cloture and end a filibuster. So in 1975, there was a rule change. The Senate reduced the number of votes required to invoke cloture from 2/3 to 3/5, or 60 votes, of the full Senate. This change makes it somewhat easier to break a filibuster, but still maintained a significant hurdle for the majority. Then we also have this idea of the nuclear option. In recent years, the Senate has altered the filibuster rules for certain types of nominations. In 2013, for example, Democrats invoked the nuclear option, reducing the cloture threshold for most presidential nominations, except for Supreme Court nominations, to a simple majority of 51 votes. And this took place in 2013. In 2017, the Republicans extended the nuclear option to Supreme Court nominations, allowing them to confirm with a simple majority. Now let's dive into the different types of filibusters that take place. The first thing we have is a talking filibuster, the traditional form of a filibuster, where a senator speaks on the Senate floor for as long as he possibly can to delay a vote. This type of filibuster often involves lengthy speeches on unrelated topics. Another type of filibuster is the silent filibuster. In modern practice, senators can indicate their intent to filibuster without speaking on the floor. This is sometimes referred to as a silent or stealth filibuster. Instead of holding the floor, a senator can simply inform the majority leader that they plan to filibuster, effectively blocking legislation unless 60 votes are gathered to invoke cloture. How has this affected legislation historically? One of the first things that happens is it obstructs legislation. Filibusters have been used to obstruct various pieces of legislation, most notably the civil rights bills in the mid-20th century. Southern senators used the filibuster to block measures aimed at dismantling segregation and expanding the voting rights of African Americans. Another impact that we get on legislation is it encourages compromise. In some cases, the threat of a filibuster has led to legislative compromise. Knowing that they would need a supermajority to overcome a filibuster, senators may seek to build broader consensus to avoid prolonged debate. Now let's dive into some examples of how the filibuster has been impacted on judicial nominations. So in recent years, the filibuster has played a role in judicial nominations. Before the nuclear option was invoked, judicial nominees could be filibustered, and a 60-vote threshold was required to break the filibuster. In 2013 and 2017, changes allowed judicial nominations to proceed with a simple majority of having significant implications for the federal judiciary. Now let's dive a little bit into Supreme Court filibusters. The most high-profile use of the filibuster in recent years has been in the context of Supreme Court nominations. The nuclear option was invoked to the lower threshold to confirm Supreme Court justices, which has since led to more partisan confirmations. However, the filibuster is not without its criticisms and calls for reform. First thing we'll look at is minority rule. Critics argue that the filibuster empowers a small minority of senators to block legislation, even if it has majority support in the Senate. This can lead to gridlock and prevent important issues from being addressed nationally. Another criticism is the inefficiency of the filibuster. The filibuster has been criticized for making the Senate seem inefficient and slow to act. Major legislation can be delayed for weeks, months, even when there's broad support for the action to take place. There's been some calls for elimination or reform of the filibuster. Some have called for the elimination or reforming of the filibuster, especially in light of the increasing partisanship. Proposals include requiring a talking filibuster to reinstate the need for continuous debate, or lowering the cloture threshold for regular legislation to a simple majority. The filibuster remains one of the most debated and controversial features of the United States Senate. Its supporters argue that it protects minority rights and encourages extended debate, while its critics see it as an obstacle to democracy and a tool for obstruction. The future of the filibuster is uncertain, as calls for reform or elimination continue to grow amid a highly polarized political climate. The filibuster's role in shaping U.S. policy, from civil rights to judicial nominations, ensures that it will remain a central issue in Senate procedure and American governance. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure to hit the subscribe button, like this video, comment, and share for more. As always, catch you guys in the next video.